The second, thank you, Craig. This is the second set of 6 of our walk through Jewish history by focusing on individual, somewhat obscure or less known characters. And just as a way of review, we began looking at the Torah period by looking at Tamar, if you remember the story with Judah. Then we went to the Judges period with Samson and Jephthah's daughter. We went to the Kings period with Gedaliah, was the last king of the Davidic line. And then we looked at the Mishnah period, the transition into the Rabbinic with Rabbi Akiba. And then we looked at the Talmudic period with Beruria, Rabbi Meir's wife, who was a scholar herself. So we're up to about the 6th century of the Common Era. So we began somewhere around 1800 before the Common Era. We're now around 600 of the Common Era, around 2,400 years through those 6 people. And what remains for us are the next 1,500 years to get us at least closer to where we are today. So today we're going to look at Nachmanides. And because we're looking at Nachmanides, we will also look at Maimonides. But first we have to get to Nachmanides. So Nachmanides is in the 11th century and into the 12th century, 11th and 12th. And we ended in the 6th. So I need to get us through those basically 600 years, 500-600 years to get us to him. So what happened? Well, when the Talmud was sealed, in some form it didn't get sealed right away. It was edited, or what's called redacted, by 2 rabbis, Rabbi Asi and Ravina, around the years in the 600 CE period. We don't know exactly. And then it was continued to be redacted for a couple of hundred years. There was a group that arose that were called the Saboraim. They were a group of rabbis, scholars, who continued to work on the Talmud and to edit it, put it into shape, the shape that we eventually received. There were 2 Talmuds at the time, and there still are. One is called the Jerusalem Talmud, and that actually is the lesser Talmud today. That has less authority today. And then there's the one that is the authoritative one, and that's called the Bavli, or the Babylonian Talmud. And when most citations are of the Talmud, it will usually say BT, Babylonian Talmud, right? JT is rare, except in certain circles. But even there, the Babylonian Talmud is preeminent over the Jerusalem Talmud. So what happened was, when the Mishnah was edited around the year 2020 CE by Judah the Prince, all of the Mishnahs were sent out to the Jewish diaspora, and everyone started studying this book. There are 6 orders in the Mishnah. It was being studied throughout the Jewish world, mainly in Babylonia and in Judea or Israel or Palestine, whatever you want to call it at the time. A little bit in Alexandria and Egypt. It was being studied. What was being studied and debated was eventually brought together by Rav Ashi and Avina in the 6th century, and that's what we call the Talmud. So the Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah, and all the books of the Talmud got put together into one series of volumes, and that is called the Talmud. The problem was, once you seal a set of books, how do you evolve the tradition? Now, in the Mishnaic period, we had a Sanhedrin. We had a central authority. So we knew who to go to get a decree or a ruling. In the Talmudic period, we had no central authority. So each center of study, each yeshiva, if you will, each center would have its key authority, and the students would go to that rabbi and ask to clarify a law. The Talmud doesn't clarify all the laws. The Talmud clarifies some laws, and some laws, many of them, it leaves with a majority opinion, a minority opinion, sometimes 3 or 4 opinions. So the question is, if I want to know what to do about a certain law, who do I go to? Well, I can go to the yeshiva that I studied in or that I know in my area. But over time, those yeshivot drifted and changed and were no longer as prominent. And what began to happen was certain rabbis acquired a reputation as being the authority in their area. And their students who became rabbis would look to that authority when they were approached with a question. So if you had a question about kosher or your sukkah or Shabbat, you go to your local rabbi and you ask your local rabbi. Your local rabbi has been taught certain things, but this question is too difficult. He doesn't know. So he says, give me some money and I'm going to send the question to my rabbi and he will send us an answer. That process is called responsa. It's a Latin term, obviously means response, but in Hebrew, it's she'elot utshuvot, questions and answers. Or in short, it's called shoot, she'elot utshuvot, shoot, the acronym. So in entire literature, what would happen is that rabbi who was asked the question would write down the answer, send it, because he received a donation by which he could live. He sent the answer to his student, who was a rabbi, and the student would give the answer to his congregant, right? Simple process, except we're not talking about the US mail or UPS or FedEx. We're talking about months.
This is GPS.
Yes, it is GPS. And it would take months for these letters to make it and get back. But once they got back, at least the student had an answer, and now the local rabbi also was guided by this answer. But the rabbi who actually composed it, because he was receiving these questions from his students in many communities, was compiling his answers, which eventually got published as a book. So the book would be called the She'elot Utshuvot, the questions and answers, according to this rabbi. And because we're talking about hundreds of years, there are lots and lots of these books. Some of them in the Sephardic areas, some in the Ashkenazic, what became the Ashkenazic areas, some out of Egypt, some out of Greece, some out of Babylonia, some out of the areas around Judea, around Palestine, some in Rome later, some that moved with the Romans into Spain, what would become Spain, what would become France, what would become Germany. They all had different names at different times. Turkey, right? Even further into what become Eastern Europe around the Black Sea. So all these rabbis were writing books. Now remember, we didn't have a printing press yet. So we're talking about writing books. We're not talking about a lot of copies. Usually what happened was a rabbi, when he published a book, published means he would have 5 or 6 copies made, and they would be sent out to his key students. They might, if they had enough wealth in their community, write a few others. In the same way that the priests, the Catholic priests, were writing the works of the church, so were these books being disseminated. Now, many of them we've lost, right? It's easy to lose these books. For one thing, if they made it into a library, and there were libraries, we know of the Great Library in Alexandria, but we also know that the Great Library in Alexandria burned, and there were tens of thousands of books lost. And once they were lost, in many cases, they were the only copy. And many of these didn't survive because there were pogroms, there were fires, there were people who used them, there were people who stole them and used them for burning their own fires. You know, they used them. We found later what happened with these parchments is people would take the parchment because it was valuable, and they would find a way to either erase or they would write on the back their own writings. They would use the parchment to bind other books. We've now uncovered entire volumes that we didn't know we had from the Middle Ages in book bindings, where they use them to make the hard covers by gluing them together, many, many copies, to make a hard cover on the outside and inside, and to make the spine. They folded these things together, used glue, and then they put a new book in the middle. I'm not talking about necessarily Jews. I'm talking about Christians or Muslims who stole the books from Jews, were confiscated from them. But in the meantime, we had a lot of these questions and answers, and they didn't all agree. Some of them were asked similar questions. Some even asked the same. And they didn't necessarily agree. So what did you do? Well, you followed your rabbi in your area. However, certain rabbis became preeminent over time. One of them, like the Gaonim, like Saja Gaon, or some of his relatives, or some others who were like in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, they issued some books that compiled other She'elot and Tshuvot into a more authoritative volume. Now, 2 things had happened since basically the Mishnah was compiled. One, Christianity became the dominant religion in Rome, right? That happened in the 4th, 5th centuries. Once Christianity became the dominant religion in Rome, Judaism was oppressed by the Christian Romans. Now, another thing happened in the 7th century. That was the rise of Islam. And Islam dominated the area of Babylonia. So these Jewish communities now were caught in 2 different cultures: a Christian dominant culture in the South and in the beginning of Europe, and in what we call the Middle East and North Africa. Eventually, the Muslim community was dominant. But these 2 massive religious movements were battling each other for dominance. Some of you know there were major battles fought between the Muslims and the Christians for domination in Europe, in Southern Europe, And of course, we know about the battle in Spain, right, between the Christians and the Muslims, because the expulsion of the Muslims ultimately was the expulsion of Jews from the southern part of Spain. So 7th through 9th century, we have these writings going on. We have these questions and answers going on. We have copies of the Talmud that people are studying and using as a text. Not all the copies of the Talmud are the same, by the way. Again, without a printing press, each copy is copied by a scribe, right? And that's a laborious process, and mistakes are made all the time. You probably, if you've ever copied a 5-page document when you were in school or did anything, probably might have left out a sentence or words here and there. It's easy to do. And they did it all the time. So we had no consistency in all this. Now, what was happening to the Jewish communities? Well, under the Christians, we know that under Rome, the Jews were suppressed. They were allowed to be Jews, but with limited access to power. But what happened in Rome was that Rome was overthrown by the Vandals, right? And therefore, Jews were kind of swept up in the chaos following the Roman Empire. Now, Jews also had followed the Romans into Spain, France, England, and Germany. Again, I'm using anachronistic names, but you know that the Romans built the wall up in Hadrian's Wall up in England. There were Jews with them up in England, where Hadrian's Wall is. They followed the Romans. They were part of the Romans' armies. They had different functions. They also were in the Germanic areas. They were in the French areas, and they were in the Spanish areas, as well as Rome and Greece itself. And Jews, of course, were still in Alexandria and in Egypt and in Babylonia. So we had spread throughout that part of the region among the Christians. They had influence over Jews in the areas that Rome dominated. And when Rome fell, there were Jewish communities left in all those places. They were small and they were Jewish, but they often didn't have rabbis. So they needed to ask questions all the time. And so a lot of the questions started coming out of those areas, particularly in the 7th and 8th centuries. And as Islam dominated in Babylonia and in the Middle East, the communities of Jews living there also began to ask these questions. Now, let me ask you, do you have any questions or any things that need to be clarified yet? What you got?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So from what I know about modern day responsa, most of them have to do with sort of lifestyle questions and, maybe practice questions. Back in this era, were the questions, like religious practice oriented? How do you practice Judaism? Or were they more the ethical, business, let's call it business, that realm of questions?
No, they were the same kind of spectrum of questions that we have, because each of these communities had their own foods, meaning different crops were in different areas. Different foods were available. They didn't have the notion of a supermarket. They didn't have the notion that you could ship foods. So you only had whatever was local. What happens, even if you have a shochet, what happens if the only animals available are chickens and pigs and sheep? And what happens if you need to talk about, because chickens in those days were meat. What if you don't have a lot of cheeses available in certain areas or certain vegetables available? Is an artichoke, for instance, the Roman community where the artichoke became important, didn't know what to do with that. Is it a kosher vegetable? Is it even a vegetable? Is it a fruit? What is it? So they had these kind of questions about foods. They had questions about prayers. The prayer book hadn't been fixed yet. It was still in development. We know, for instance, we have Amram Gaon's prayer book from the 8th century, and it's not identical to the prayer books of the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. So there were certain prayers that were fixed, but lots of prayers that weren't. There were questions about how should they deal with the pressure of conversion issues. There were questions about dress issues. What kind of fabrics were available to them that they could use, and what, they had all, like a sukkah. What could they cover the sukkah with if they lived in an area that was heavily winter in October, and there were no real leaves of any nature to cover? What do you do? I mean, because our religion grew up in a desert country, a warm country. And even in Babylonia, it was roughly equivalent in temperature, and in North Africa. Even Rome was more moderate temperatures. But moving into Europe, they had all kinds of things to deal with that they had to ask questions about. And then they had ethical, moral questions. They had legal questions, about how do you deal with witnesses? What if you don't have two kosher witnesses? All kinds of basic questions about ketubas. And again, ketubas weren't all written by experts. They weren't always written clearly or well. Names were not always clearly understood. Divorces, how do you deal with it? So all the same questions, but localized, okay? And then what happened was, when these rabbis published their books of questions and answers, they put them in categories. And the categories were similar to the categories of the Mishnah. But there were no central code books that could bring all these Shelot and Chulot together and say, this is the law today, right? We've already been hundreds of years after the Talmud. What is the standard law? So roughly in the period of the 11th century, in Morocco, a Rabbi Al-Fassi, who's known as the Rif. That's West Side Story, I think, wasn't that Rif? Well, the Rif, the original Rif, compiled a book, and he organized all of the Shelot and Chuvot of his communities and all the books he could get hold of, and he put it into one code. So at that point, we now have two different models for how you can learn about halacha if you're a Jew living anywhere in the world. One, you can ask a question, or two, you can reference the code, because the code they started to write copies of it and send it out. From that point on, those two genres of Jewish literature became standard. All right? Nobody was going to write another Talmud, and nobody was going to write another Mishnah. But there would be many codes written, and there are still codes being written today. There would be books of questions and answers written. And as Charles said, there are still books of questions and answers being written today, here and in Israel and other places. So both of those processes helped Jewish communities remain Jewish when they had the pressure of Christianity and of Islam. Remember, both Christianity and Islam were proselytizing religions. They were constantly hawking Jews to convert. And in some areas, they were successful. And in many times, they used physical pressure. And as we know, when we get to the period in Spain, they used ultimate physical pressure and expulsion. Right? So all of this was building up. Jews had no political power. Jews had no military power. The only economic power Jews had were really in finance. That's important because Christianity was still wrestling with whether Christians could loan money to other Christians. Because in the Bible, in our Bible, it says you should not loan for interest. And the interpretation was a fellow religionist. A Jew shouldn't loan another Jew on interest. Well, the Christians took that to mean a Christian should not loan a Christian on interest. Right? So who was going to loan them money when they needed it? Well, they didn't trust the Muslims because they were at war with the Muslims. Who else was there? There were Jews, and Jews had been literate and knew mathematics and had been involved in business for a long time. And Jewish communities did business with each other. That was already going on during the time of the Mishnah, Talmud, and beyond. Jewish communities did business with each other. We had a network of business. We trusted each other. Now, Christians did not trust each other in the same way. It was not the same kind of community. So, what did they do? They went to Jews. Jews became not only money lenders, but the banks. They were the banks in every way. They valued things. They wrote the contracts in many cases. So Jews had power in finance, but no power to uphold the debt because they had no political or military power. Jews were not allowed to own land. So we didn't have the power of land ownership. We were not allowed to serve in the military. So we were not experts in weapons to defend ourselves. Right? So we were very vulnerable, but we had influence, and we had to use our influence as best we could. Everywhere in the Christian world and everywhere in the Muslim world, we were vulnerable. But our influence was important because the rulers of those areas wanted to maintain their power, and the only way they could maintain their power was by their economic growth and their own military power. And they were dependent on banks, meaning Jews, in order to keep growing economically. So there were a lot of times as we were developing our communities where we were killed, we were slaughtered, we were thrown out. There were all kinds of those things happening. But by and large, we lived as best we could in the communities we were in until we couldn't live there anymore. And then we moved on to another community and we started again. The only thing we took with us was our brains. That's why Jewish education was so essential for survival, not just for economics. Because when you had to leave, if they took everything, you still knew how to do business. You still knew how to read. You still could make a living. You could figure it out. As long as you were alive and your family could come with you. Right? So that became our survival tool, teaching our families how to read, write, and do math and do business. As well as there were certain trades that we got very good at. We got good at gold and silver. Why? Because it was a source of wealth. Again, the wealthy people wanted gold and silver. If we had it, they needed us. If we were experts. And what else did we become good at? Jewels. Because jewels are very small and they are very desirable with people who have great wealth. And they wanted to know that the jewel was quality. And we became the Christian and Muslim experts in diamonds, but not just diamonds, but all kinds of gems. And by that, we played another role. But it also meant that we had the ability to transport wealth for the first time, right? There wasn't paper money. That wasn't the way you dealt with it. Gold is too heavy. Silver is too heavy. How much gold can you take when you're running away, right? And it's easily found. But if you take your diamonds and sew them into the part of your clothes, you can walk out of a country with only the clothes on your back and start again with a couple of diamonds or a couple of emeralds or a couple of topaz, whatever it is, you could start again. And that became an important survival technique for Jews as we developed in these countries. And all of this was because we had no power. Any questions before I get to our two scholars, Nachmanides and Maimonides? Okay, so we get up to the Crusades. The wars between the Muslims and the Christians are ongoing. You know the Crusades is part of that war. The Crusaders were going there to free Jerusalem and to kick the Muslims out. On the way, by the way, they slaughtered Jews throughout Germany and France. You know, it was practice. But more than practice, they also got to steal booty from the Jews. And they also were able to convert Jewish communities. Now, how did they do that? Well, when they came to a Jewish town, they would say, convert or die. The first town said, we refuse to convert. We are Jews. So they were killed. Well, word got out to the next town. So what did the Jews do? They converted, and then when the Crusaders walked on, they went to the rabbi and said, can we come back? And the rabbi wrote to his rabbi, and his rabbi said it was under duress. Of course you can come back. On Yom Kippur, you'll do teshuvah. You are still a Jew. You just sinned. Now, have teshuvah, expiate the sin. You're Jewish. Those Jews learned how to survive by lying, right? Because when your life is threatened, are you allowed to lie? Yes. There are very few cases where you're not. There are only 3. There's the case where you are publicly commanded to bow down to an idol. If you are publicly commanded to bow to an idol, you must allow them to kill you. If you are publicly commanded to kill an innocent person, or you will be killed, you must be killed. You must allow yourself to be killed. If you can't kill the person who's threatening you. And the third case has to do with rape, because they believe that women who were raped should rather submit to death, should protest and fight and die in that. But other than that, the rule was get out of it any way you can and then do teshuvah. Because obviously you weren't sincere in converting. Your only sincerity was staying alive. So now we come to Spain. Spain in the 10th and 11th century the Muslims have conquered much of Spain and pushed the Christians to the north of Spain and in France. The Muslims are trying to conquer France. They fail in that, but they establish themselves firmly in Spain. The Jews who are caught up in Spain were under the Christians, but now became under the Muslims. One of those who remained under the Christians was Nachmanides, Ramban with an N, a nun at the end. Ramban means Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. That's his father. Rambam with a M or a mem is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, his father. Maimonides is a Greek way of saying son of Maimon or son of Nachman, Nachmanides. Ides is like Johnson, son. That's what it means. Okay? Every language has a son of as an ending or beginning in the language. Okay, you with me so far? So Nachmanides becomes the preeminent rabbi in the Christian Spanish area in the north of Spain. And he is well received by the king and well treated. At a certain point, when the Muslims in southern Spain are beginning to oppress the Jews of southern Spain, we begin to have the tension with the Christians in Spain and the Jews in Spain. And Nachmanides gets caught up in what's called a disputation. So I don't know if any of you read it, what I sent you, but he is commanded to dispute with a man who was a knowledgeable Jew who had converted for many reasons to Christianity and now was willing to denounce the Jews. So he had to go into this disputation with the king as the judge. The Dominicans were dominant in the religious orders there, and they were very hostile to Jews. They were very much a part of this trial. The disputation was a trial. Now, we have records of that trial published by Nachmanides, published by the disputants. We know what was said and what wasn't, more or less. The king favored Nachmanides and ruled in his favor and even gave him money as a reward. But the Dominicans were not happy. The Dominicans basically made it impossible for the king to let Nachmanides off the hook. So the king expelled Nachmanides for 2 years, but the Dominicans made it permanent. So Nachmanides now had to leave his home and begin wandering. Where did he go? He stayed in Christian Spain, wandering around for a few years. But he couldn't establish himself there because of what had happened, because of the Dominicans. So he bit the bullet, and he went down to Morocco. And eventually he went to Palestine. And he settled in Palestine. Now, the reason I wanted to focus on Nachmanides is because Maimonides has become much more the great figure of this period. And in many ways, there are good reason for that. But I want you to know about Nachmanides, that everything that happened to Maimonides happened to Nachmanides, but Nachmanides dealt with Christians, and they were much more vicious toward Jews than the Muslims. It was much more difficult to deal with Christians than Muslims. Muslims oppressed Jews. Muslims expelled Jews from time to time. Muslims even killed Jews, but not at the rate and the way that Christians did. Nazis could only arise in Europe, in a Christian environment. It could not have arisen in the Muslim environment. And everything that's going on in the Muslim world that reflects Nazism comes out of the Nazi literature and the Russian anti-Semitic literature. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which has now been translated into Arabic and is distributed in tens of millions of copies throughout the Arab world. They would not have come up with that. It's not the culture of that world, but they've embraced it now for many reasons. But we're not there yet. We're still back in 11th century and 12th century Spain. So Nachmanides ends up in Palestine. He founds a synagogue in Jerusalem and establishes the Jewish community in Jerusalem because we got the Crusaders there. You know, the Crusaders are creating problems. They're Christian. They don't love Jews. So he founds a little community in Jerusalem, founds a synagogue, and that synagogue is still there today. And I've prayed in it. You might have prayed in it on one of your trips. It's still there. It's been redone. It's beautiful. It's a little shul in the old city called the Ramban Synagogue, Nachmanides Synagogue, and it's still used on a daily basis. He died there in Palestine. We don't know where he was buried. There are legends of Haifa, Akko. We don't know exactly where he got buried. Some of our greats like Rambam, we do have markers for. We do have markers for certain ones where at least there's a tradition. We don't have one for Nachmanides. What Nachmanides did was he created another kind of literature that we most know Rashi for. Rashi was Rashi was in France, Christian France, and he created the notion of commentary on the Bible, but also commentary on the Talmud. Line by line commentary, phrase by phrase commentary. Rashi is the most famous, but Nachmanides is one of the three most famous in the Torah and the Bible, the Tanakh, the Bible. His commentaries have much more dealing with Kabbalah. He's much more expansive than Rashi. He brings in far more explanations. You could say he's more verbose. But he is one of the great figures of that period. Now, Rambam, and it was another one of the readings I gave you, Rambam is much more controversial than Nachmanides. Nachmanides was he was a person that tried to make nice with all the conflicts in the Jewish world. The big conflict in his time was about Maimonides. Maimonides wrote this book called the Moreh Nevuchim. Moreh Nevuchim is the guide for the perplexed. Guide for the Perplexed. What is that book? Maimonides wrote a book for Jewish people who were confused about Judaism. They said, we don't get it. And they were thinking about Christianity and Islam, and they didn't buy all of this stuff they were being taught. The miracles and all kinds of things, they didn't buy it. So Maimonides wrote a book for them. It's a very controversial book among Jewish tradition. There were Jews who burned it. There were Jews who put it in cherem, which means you could not touch it or get near it. It's like what's going on with mouse in that library in wherever it is, in Wisconsin or Virginia. Anyway, what happened was Maimonides' controversy brought a split to the Jewish world. Nachmanides tried to mediate between the communities, because Nachmanides lived about 50 years after Maimonides. He tried to mediate. He tried to make nice. He tried to show where you could be a little of both, because he respected Maimonides. He respected what he wrote. And he didn't believe that Maimonides was a heretic, but he was trying to get the community to come together. Maimonides didn't care that the community was inflamed, because that's the kind of guy he was. His job, he believed, was to tell it like it is. He was a tough guy. He was an egotist. I'll tell you how much of an egotist he was. In his own time, there's a phrase which is on his gravestone. Now, he didn't write the gravestone, but he didn't denounce the phrase either. Phrase in Hebrew is this: Mi Moshe ad Moshe ein k'Moshe. From Moses Rabbeinu to Moses Maimonides, there has never been one like Moses. You get it? And he probably saw himself like that. He saw himself as Moses, our teacher incarnate in a new time. And he acted that way. When he wrote his code book, I told you about codes, told you about the Rif. Well, Maimonides wrote a code book too, but he titled it Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah has two aspects that are very interesting. Mishnah Torah in Hebrew is what we call Deuteronomy in the Torah. That's the Hebrew name for Deuteronomy. It's not Deuteronomy in Hebrew, it's Mishnah Torah. So he titled his own code book Mishnah Torah, the Deuteronomy of his day. Deuteronomy was ostensibly written by Moses, given by God. Second thing is he used the word Torah in that title. The Rif wouldn't do that. The Shulchan Aruch was another code book later. They didn't do that, but Maimonides would do that. He also wrote commentaries. Now, he wrote commentaries on the Bible, on the Torah. Nachmanides often disagreed with Maimonides. And one of the interesting things, if you look at the Mishnah Torah written in Hebrew in a regular traditional edition, what you'll see is it will write, and then there's a little insert from a guy called the Rabbad, who would say, this is lunacy. Right in the text, when it got published, it was published with the guys that criticized Maimonides, and when they criticized him the way he criticized them. It would say, there is no basis for this ruling. Maimonides would make a ruling and he didn't give why. He would just say, this is it. But by the way, the reason the Babylonian Talmud, one of the main reasons the Babylonian Talmud is the preeminent Talmud today, is because Maimonides decreed it so. Now that didn't happen overnight. It took hundreds and hundreds of years until his view was accepted. Nothing happens quickly in the Jewish world unless it's the Christians that do it to us or the Muslims that do it to us. When we do it to ourselves, we take our time, right? You know, you can see it today. We take our time in going after each other in different movements and criticizing each other and trying to figure it out. And we're willing to take hundreds of years because we're in it for the long run. So what ended up, what is shown in Maimonides and Nachmanides, was two great rabbis living in this at the same time, 50 years apart, but during the same time. They overlapped. And these two great rabbis had to have a similar life's path. They both got expelled. They both were valued by their community. They both had good careers. They both wrote great volumes. They both ended up near Palestine. Maimonides ended up in Egypt, and Nachmanides in Palestine. They both were venerated by their community, and they both are followed today in much of what they wrote. But one encountered the Christian world and one encountered the Muslim world. From this point on, as we move forward in history, we're now going to be moving forward where the two worlds will not really touch each other much. The woman we're going to look at next, Dona Gracia Mendez Nasi, actually ends up kind of being in both worlds. But it will show you what happens as the two Jewish worlds begin to separate. So that once we get into the period of the Middle Ages, the Muslim Jewish world is pretty much isolated within its own world, with its own rabbis, with its own codes, with its own customs. And that's why at Passover, that world can eat rice during Pesach. And in the Christian world, the Ashkenazic world, you can't eat rice. I mean, that's only one little example. There are lots of examples because that world got sealed off and the Christian world got sealed off. They traveled between them for business, but the halachic worlds pretty much got separated. And the separation is something we begin to look at. They don't really influence each other as much until Israel is founded in 1948. And today we have a reblending, finally, of those two communities in a real way, an essential way. Something that hasn't happened since basically the period of Nachmanides and Maimonides, when you could still travel easily between and when they wrote for each other. But that ended at that period with basically this changing nature of the two worlds, the Muslim world and the Christian world. The Muslims stopped trying to attack Europe. Christians stopped trying to attack the Muslims. The Crusades failed. And by the 13th century, the Christians stayed in Europe and stopped sending crusades down to attack the Muslims. And the Muslims stopped sending armies to attack the Christians. And they reconciled the fact that they were not going to get Spain again. They stayed in North Africa, and they realized it wasn't going to happen for them in Spain. And so we now had a boundary. And that affected the Jewish world. Any questions, comments?
Oh. Amazing.
What? Yes, Holly.
Did the two of them ever meet since they lived at the same time?
We don't know if they physically met, and probably they didn't, because Maimonides was like 50, if I remember, 53 or 55 years old when Nachmanides was born. They both lived into their 70s, but Nachmanides was not expelled until he was already, we don't know exactly their ages when all this happened, but he was probably still in Spain when Maimonides was down already by then in Egypt. And either way, Maimonides would have been in Muslim Spain, Nachmanides in Christian Spain, and that border was a pretty tough border, and there would be no reason why he would go down there. So they probably never met, but they certainly knew of each other, and they certainly knew, Nachmanides knew of all of Maimonides' writings. Whether Maimonides knew Nachmanides' writings is a question. I would doubt it. He would have heard of him by reputation.
Did his family ever join him in Israel?
Who?
Nachman.
Oh, not Palestine? Well, yes, I mean, parts of his family came with him, some, didn't. But some were killed and some didn't make the trip, and people died in those days of disease along the way. It was not a simple trip. The whole idea of even going down there, whether he went by sea or by land was more dangerous than sea. Sea was dangerous because ships capsized all the time. Those ships were not all that wonderfully sturdy, and there are big storms in the Mediterranean. We have lots of stories in the Talmud of ships and storms that capsize those ships in that sea. If you went by land, you encountered all kinds of dangers, different groups along the way that were very hostile. So we don't know much about that. We don't even know where he's buried, and we don't know a lot about the details because they didn't really focus on their lives. They focused much more on the text. That's what we know them for. We know more about Maimonides, partly because it was preserved in some of the writings of his students. Anyway, so now we have, oh yes, Marty, last question.
Oh, I was just thinking about what it must have taken, going back to the time when they were sending questions, rabbis to a rabbi, and if the same question from two different areas came back to two different people, obviously they might have gotten two different answers. And what it must have taken to sift through, or however they got to it, to sift through this to finally determine on which one of the two or three might be the one to follow.
Right, and it all is based on the Jewish notion when we talked about the Midrash, the notion that we read ourselves into the text.
Yeah.
So each community had to read itself into the text. But ultimately, you want to get a consensus. So over time, each community was doing something legitimate. That's what we believe. And ultimately, it got brought together. That doesn't mean they sinned along the way.
Yeah.
They were doing what they knew was right at the time for them. That's true for us, by the way. It may be that the decision that the rabbis have made, Orthodox rabbis, about electricity and Shabbat will end up being wrong.
Yeah.
Who knows what it will be. There's a lot of things that have been decided over the last 100 years with technology that might not look that way in 100 years once it's all brought together. But all of those Shelot and Chulot are going on now. And rabbis are writing books. And there are codes that are starting to emerge. But there hasn't been a master code for quite a long time. And we'll see when the next one emerges that is accepted by the Jewish world. It will probably be out of Israel, if it happens at all. So see you next week. We're on now on Thursday night, 7 o'clock.
Yay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a good night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Join
Bye.
us. Bye.